Welcome to Against the Tide, the podcast where extraordinary social change makers share their stories and their wisdom. Against the Tide is a celebration of courageous women who create lasting impact by daring to forge their own path. We'll dive deep into powerful themes such as the complexity of identity and how it influences the choices we make, embracing change even when it feels uncomfortable, and how breaking free from labels can unlock your true potential. Join me, Jo Metcalf, to hear stories of incredible women who, by swimming against the tide, prove that extraordinary things can happen. So welcome, Isabelle. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. So rather than interviewing a guest, we're going to have a conversation and explore the previous series. It feels like a full circle moment. You were the first guest on the very first episode as we were exploring and experimenting with Against the Tide. And I'm so excited to have you on today to reflect back. I know we had some fantastic conversations, particularly around imposter thoughts, and our listeners have come back and asked lots of questions and engaged in that. So, welcome back.
Thank you, and thank you for having me back. I'm excited to, talk about all the guests that you've had and some of the themes that have come through. So it'll be really interesting.
This is exciting. So one of the areas that stood out particularly for me was this sense of starting with self and the power that this has to transform how we show up and particularly how we show up in a leadership role as well.
Yeah. So what, thinking about some of your guests, what do you think kind of self-awareness means when you think about what people have explored when we've been talking about self?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The difference between having a critical voice around self-awareness and a more compassionate voice around self-awareness, and that we often think about being critical, don't we? And talk about in the voices in our head are saying things to us that we shouldn't be doing that, we're not that, we are this, and all those sorts of things. So actually tuning into some of that and really understanding what those voices are trying to tell you, why they are there, and are they helpful or unhelpful for our awareness. And for me, it's definitely about starting with awareness. These behaviours can't change until you notice them and you are aware of them. Definitely, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting, I think, that exactly what you talked about, that kind of tension that we have between accepting where we are, but caring enough about ourselves or something to change as well. It sort of feels like a bit of a weird tension or a paradox. And something that I'm quite interested in is, I don't know if you've heard of Kristin Neff. She does quite a lot of research around self-compassion and how that kind of compassion for ourselves can almost be like the catalyst for creating the changes that we want to see. So it's such a fascinating tension when we think about things like self-improvement and swimming against the tide, what allows us to do that.
And this what triggers you as well and what doesn't trigger you. So I've definitely started noticing when I've become more aware of my own behaviours, when I feel uncomfortable and when I don't feel uncomfortable. What is that? I'm really starting to just notice that and then think about the triggers within it.
Because I think sometimes when we sort of work on our self-awareness, it's really good for us to kind of reflect on our own behaviours and like you were saying, what's going on inside and how that leads to the actions we take. But the other thing that I really like getting people to think about as well is that what the context is doing, because sometimes we can change ourselves, but we'll find ourselves in particular contexts where we kind of shrink back or we feel uncomfortable or we feel like we don't belong. And then there's definitely something in the system at play. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that as well, rather than just feel like we always have to be changing ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. I think overall, really, my reflection on the series and what I've heard so far is this sense of the internal versus the external and what's going on for you in your mind versus how you show up and how they interact with each other as well. I don't know what your overall sort of reflections are on that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think sometimes we have like this very internalized, in psychology we call it locus of control. So this idea of, I'm the agent that can change things, and sometimes that's externalized. So we're more thinking that things are happening outside ourselves and we have less control. So I think and a lot of your guests talked about being in settings where they didn't feel like they belonged, or their identity wasn't able to fully play out in terms of sort of what was important to them and things. um I mean, the sense that I got was a lot of your guests had this sort of strong sense of autonomy and agency. So that internal locus of control of, you know, things are difficult. I'm coming up against all these barriers, but I do have some form of agency here where I can sort of develop along a path that I want to.
Yeah. And what do you think helps people with that agency?
It's a really interesting one. I think there's a few things. I mean, coming back to context as well, and I know a lot of your guests talked about systems and not only sort of recognizing the barriers within the system, but also trying to change the system. So sort of really recognizing where those kind of barriers are and thinking about, what can we do to change those. Community as well, that's another thing that seemed to come up quite a lot, is sort of surrounding yourself with people that if you don't have the answers, there are people that can support you or help you find the answers. So I suppose in a way kind of finding your tribe. Um, and then I suppose the third thing that I would think about when it comes to sort of that sense of agency is being connected to the things that are really important to us. So when things get difficult and we're feeling powerless, thinking about, where am I trying to get to? What's important here? And how can I move towards that thing, that goal, that North Star?
The bit I found fascinating is, and this is probably part of why I started Against the Tide, really, this sense that some people get to that difficult bit.
Yeah.
Some people revert back. Some
Yeah.
people drive through that. And the other thing that really came up is this sense of self-doubt.
Yeah.
And you've talked previously around that sitting on a continuum. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I find this so fascinating because there's so many tensions. I think, we talked about the tension before about accepting where we are and wanting to change all at the same time. And I think this is kind of a similar thing where if we go too far into doubting ourselves, we kind of go into inaction because we're so sort of scared of what the consequences might be. We don't have that sense of, I can work this out. I've got resources inside me that can help. We can sort of really tip into that real sort of self-doubt and not really make the changes that we want to make. But I think on the other side of that is the overconfidence. And God knows we've got enough overconfident leaders in the world who don't question themselves at all. So I think there's definitely something in this idea of kind of holding that self-doubt as something that is really important, because it stops us from stepping into that sort of real overconfidence where we don't question ourselves. We just plow on through. So yeah, it's kind of a tension for us to hold, for us to recognize, like, am I where I need to be in this kind of continuum between sort of extreme self-doubt and overconfidence? Do I need to dial up the confidence a little bit, or do I need to stand back and question more? And I think, there's never a clear answer to that. It'll depend on the situation that we're in.
Yeah, the other thing linked to that is what I heard from the guests and saw with the guests was this sense of humble leadership and humility within how they approach things, and that it's not about them, and sort of removing that ego, and that self-doubt acts as that check and balance, which links to sort of what you were just saying there, really. Yeah, anything else on that?
Yeah, I mean, that humble leadership is so important. I think it really did come through. I think, thinking about your guests and how they were swimming against the tide, it is about doing things differently, isn't it? It's sort of recognizing that the systems that are in place around sort of leadership and the way that things are done aren't necessarily the things that the world needs right now. And yeah, being able to go out and ask questions, be curious. I mean, curiosity gets us to lots of interesting and valuable places, I think. And if we're not curious, we can quite often go to blame, or we can go to yeah, that overconfidence. So it really helps with that curiosity.
Yeah, definitely. And my sense is that you can only do that if you are self-aware.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, self-awareness is such an interesting one, isn't it? Because we don't always know what we're not being self-aware about. It's one of those really strange ones, where we can think we're being self-aware, but actually lots of other people are seeing something that we're not seeing, whether that's a kind of helpful attribute or one that's not so helpful. So I think that sort of willingness to open up to feedback, sort of collecting data, those kinds of things, are really useful for kind of, yeah, thinking about how we want to navigate that path forward.
Yeah, so if people are curious around self-awareness as that starting point,
Mm.
as a psychologist, what are the things that people can think about to increase their self-awareness?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole variety of things you could do. I mean, one is asking questions. So, gathering feedback where possible. So, in organizations, people often do those 360 interviews, but I would say just having a trusted network where you can go out and say, how did this land? What are your thoughts on it? What could I have done differently? And just always being willing to kind of gather other perspectives, because we can stay very locked into our own perspective. Um, Having conversations about how we're feeling about things, what that might mean for our behavior. So, people might go to a therapist or a coach, but even just a trusted friend, or getting your thoughts out, and journaling can just help us sort of make that connection between how we're thinking or feeling and what we're doing. That kind of reflective process is so useful in helping us figure out, what works well for me, what doesn't work quite so well, and what some of the things that stop me from behaving like the person that I really want to be.
Mm. I think you've talked about this on the podcast where you were saying thoughts, feelings lead to behaviours,
Mm.
and I think that's a useful analogy, really, isn't it? Thinking
Mm.
about actually how your thoughts are driving of what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. And I think something that really came through with a lot of your guests is that willingness to, when those uncomfortable emotions show up, that willingness to kind of go towards what's important anyway. So
Mm.
sort of carry them with us rather than allowing them to kind of drive what we do next, or turn us away from the thing that we really want to be doing.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Do you want to just explain that a little bit more around carrying it with you rather than holding it, and how
Yeah.
that sort of limits some people?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's a really interesting idea, and it's something that I find really helpful, is this idea of, when tricky emotions show up. You'll notice I don't use the words positive or negative
Mm.
emotions, because I feel like all emotions just are what they are, and some are a bit less comfortable to experience than others. But what can happen with those really uncomfortable emotions is that we can kind of turn away from them. Um, we can try and avoid them and push them away, and that often means that we go into inaction. So we don't want to feel the feeling, so we don't do the thing. Um, and those emotions in that instance are often sort of so present and so in front of us, we can't really see what's important. They're kind of almost in front of our face. So they sort of obscure the view. This idea of willingness is more like, instead of having them in front of our face, we sort of put them in our pocket. So we carry them with us, and we sort of know that they're there. So whether that's fear, whether that's sort of a sense of shame or worry, or any of those emotions that can be quite difficult and almost debilitating, we sort of acknowledge that they're there. We have compassion with ourselves, and we just sort of put them in our pocket and carry them with us. So it's about a willingness to experience that discomfort in the service of what's really important to us.
Yeah, I think that definitely goes back to that self-awareness.
Mm.
What other tensions do you see when people are trying to understand themselves?
Um, Well, there are so many different tensions, and it's really interesting, I think, to kind of help people. When I'm working with people, either on a one-to-one or as a team, sort of think about holding two truths as um, equally present. So we tend to either think it's this or it's that, but actually sometimes two or three or four things are all true at the same time. So sometimes we have to sort of be a little bit willing to hold that complexity and kind of think, this isn't straightforward, and just allow multiple things to be true. So I encourage people to replace the word but with and that can unlock so many different things, so many different paths forward. So where we might say, I'd like to speak up in this situation, but I'm afraid, we can say, I'd like to speak up in this situation and I'm afraid. And that allows us to actually take action, whereas the but disqualifies the action.
Fascinating. Bess was on the podcast and I
Yes,
did
I remember.
Firefly Adventure
Yeah.
with Bess, and that really showed me that the paradox she talks about, that actually you can be one thing and you can be the other.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite freeing, I think, on so many levels, isn't it?
It really is.
I think people often see me as an extrovert, but actually I'm an introvert. We can be both of those things, rather than thinking you have to be one or the other. Different situations bring out different things within you as well, don't they? So
Yeah, they definitely do. And I think that kind of, exactly what you said, that kind of context, being aware of context. I think that's also part of self-awareness is, you might say something like, I am a kind person, but there might be a particular situation where you're really overextending that kindness, and actually that's leading to you overgiving. So it's sort of recognizing in which situations can you be a particular way, and in what situations might you need to dial that down a little.
yeah, and what's your actual natural state?
Yeah.
I think as mums, as high performing individuals, you play different roles in different scenarios, don't you? And it's what is true to you and what are you showing up and where do you feel most comfortable? I find it fascinating.
It's so fascinating. Yeah, the psychology of identity is so interesting.
Yeah.
Because, like you say, we're so many different things all at once, and identity can be so useful to helping us navigate. Like, I'm a mum of 3 children. Well, actually, 2 of them are more grown up. And so what it means to me to be a mum helps me navigate how I show up. So it gives me like a sense of cohesion. But there's certain other aspects of my personality, like if I said I identify as someone who's not very confident, then that would sort of hold me back. So it's thinking about, where do I need that cohesion to help me understand those elements of my identity, and where do I need to sort of let go of, this is who I am, because it's closing down possibility.
Yeah, we've spoken quite a few times around identity and being your whole self, and showing up as your whole self, and authenticity, which
Yeah.
lots of words that people use. But what does that mean in reality, and how we feel like we should be able to show up as our whole self? But yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, like, that idea of authentic leadership, or kind of bringing your whole self to work, because I think particularly, for women, um, it can be difficult to bring your whole self to work, because you need to feel a certain sense of safety and belonging to be able to kind of be vulnerable. And I think that we're not always, or people aren't always, feeling sort of safe in particular situations, and so we kind of assume that, everyone's voice matters, but we can only have that confidence that it matters if people have told us that our voice matters. So sometimes people really do hold back, and it's about that kind of safety. I mean, you've worked in sort of some quite male-dominated environments, haven't you? How's that shown up for you, that sense of whether or not you can speak up?
fascinating question. And
Mm.
inclusion and belongings come up throughout the whole Against the Tide, whether that's a positive or a negative.
Yeah.
But bit of my context and background. So my first career was in corporate finance, and I can remember I got a role that was a PA to quite a senior person in the banking environment. And I turned up and there was lots of women just sat outside the offices with men sat inside the offices. And I felt like I had to behave in a particular way as
Yeah.
a 19, 20-year-old coming into this environment. But looking back, I would have spoken up a lot more if people said what they said then. Now, fast forward 20 years later, I've been in lots of different environments that still make me feel like I want to shrink. And it's really interesting when you start to reflect on some of that of, is it the environment? Is it my identity and the voices in my head that are saying to me that your background doesn't mean that you belong in that space versus something that they're actually doing. So it's that internal versus external environment again, isn't it? And I've tried over the years, and I think I've definitely got better at it in the sense that I'll show up as me now or try, but still there are triggers.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's fascinating noticing it. And you could see it with the guests actually chatting about some environments make you feel like you can take on the world and then other environments don't. So I'd be interested in, from a psychology point of view, how could you give advice and guidance for people that feel like I felt over the years? Yeah.
Well, I wonder if I might answer your question with a question, which I know
Okay,
is quite
go for it,
annoying.
go for it.
But what do you think? Because you talked about like when you turned up and you wouldn't have spoken out, and now you do and you show up more authentically. What do you think has been that shift for you over those years?
Interesting question. I think it's because I've been more self-aware. I've done work understanding psychology. I studied behaviour change, and you see in the environment women challenging those things. So I think looking at other leaders and realising that there is a different way. You don't have to follow the traditional path. Nothing's ever perfect. Nothing ever can't be done better. So I always like to think, well, how can something be changed? How can something be different? So it's been an interesting, experiment really, thinking about how do I challenge that in a way that you start to push those boundaries. So through experience, I suppose, just testing and pushing. You're seeing nothing falls. I've not died. You can challenge these things, yeah.
And where do you think that sense of like, wanting to disrupt and challenge, where has that come from? Because, looking at your whole span of work and all the things you do, that seems to be a real theme that runs through it all is like, come on, let's
do it
bend this rule
better.
book and do things a bit differently.
Where does that come from? I think I was always a child that was very much about let me get out of here, let me do something different. I'd never wanted to fit a mold, and I think society puts you in boxes and puts you in molds, and I think there's only so long that if you are a bit of a disruptor that you will stay inside that box because it feels uncomfortable. So I think listening to the guests, I've got a sense from the guests that's helped me actually on many levels that if you feel uncomfortable, it's trying to tell you something that you need to do something different. So listening to that and leaning into that, testing it and seeing what feels more aligned to your values and your beliefs. And it's often when I felt uncomfortable is when I'm not doing something that's aligned to my values and beliefs, really.
It's so interesting, isn't it? When I mean, I've noticed personally as well, that's been a real shift in me when I've started to recognize that those uncomfortable feelings don't mean there's something wrong with me. They actually mean I might be on an edge, like a learning edge or the edge of something big or something that will change things. So that ability to lean into discomfort. And I think that has really been a thread through a lot of your guests, hasn't it? Of like,
Definitely.
I'm feeling uncomfortable. What does that mean? And I suppose we go back to that curiosity. Does it mean I need to change? Does it mean the system needs to change?
I think one of the conversations that really resonated with me was with Holly around the stories that we tell ourselves and how they play out in your mind, which I think you're sort of trying to poke at, trying to get out of me, really. Like, I think, being from a working class background, being from the north of England, and then finding yourselves in situations where it's outside of your comfort zone and you're like, oh my gosh, this is uncomfortable. But it's almost exciting at the same time. It's like a weird sort of feeling, and I actually quite like that uncomfortable. If I'm bored and things are almost like running smoothly, I'm like, what is going on here? Like, need something. If you've got any guidance for people that feel the same, really, and how we really identify the spaces that we want to belong in rather than feeling like we should belong in them.
Yeah, I think that difference between sort of belonging and fitting in is so interesting, isn't it? Because I think, we've both had that experience in our younger years of trying to fit in and fit into a mold and sort of looking at the status quo and thinking, well, this is how I should be. So we sort of change ourselves to fit in. And then I don't know if it comes with age or experience or doing sort of the internal work, but I think you sort of eventually have this realization that fitting in just isn't the same as truly belonging and being somewhere where you're sort of accepted for who you are and what you believe in. And that doesn't mean that you're in a situation that's like really comfortable all the time and it's all sort of hugs and sometimes situations where you belong have real challenge in them, but you're able to sort of do that challenge in a way that really looks after everyone that's involved in that kind of conflict, and you can conflict well. So yeah, what advice would I give people? I mean, I think it does go back to that awareness piece. It's sort of, I work with a lot of people that have spent their whole careers feeling like they don't fit in and that there's something wrong with them. And I think it's so important to look at what's around you and how people are behaving towards you and what the system that you're in is influencing in terms of your experience. And I think often it's both. Like, we talked about agency before. So, you may have more agency and control than you realize, but at the same time, it's so important to recognize that not everything is your responsibility. Sometimes, systems need to change, and people do talk to us in ways that aren't acceptable or behave towards us in ways that, need to change. And it's acknowledging that as well.
And I think you said this in your podcast, which it's about creating your own tables rather than trying to force yourself around the wrong tables. How do you create this sense of community, not necessarily of like-minded people, because I do agree in that sense that we need challenge. So you don't want just a room of people that are saying the same thing. We need inclusion, and inclusion being important in that. So how do we create our own table that creates a challenge, got a sense of belonging, and that we can bring the different facets of ourselves that we want to bring to that as well?
Well, when you think about kind of the psychology that sits underneath belonging, if we look at one of my favorite psychological theories, if you can have one, which is self-determination theory, it looks at kind of the three components that we need for our sort of intrinsic motivation and psychological well-being. And in that framework, the idea of belonging isn't just about finding places where we kind of fit. It's about feeling like we matter. So feeling like we can contribute. So it's not just about getting things back. It's also about what we're contributing and how we're seen as, an integral piece of a sort of a mission or a purpose. So it's belonging is sort of like a two-way street when you look at it like that. It's not just about feeling like you're cared for, it's also feeling like you're contributing. And I think contribution is such an important part of this whole picture, you know, feeling like we matter, feeling like we're working towards something that's sort of bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. Sort of mastery theory and things like that. And I definitely feel happier in spaces that challenge me and that are testing me, but they feel safe at the same time. It's
Yeah.
quite an interesting sort of dynamic, isn't it? That if you're in a really nice space, then it feels all lovely, but that doesn't challenge you.
Yeah.
That's still not right either, is it?
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at theories like sort of Amy Edmonds's work, which I know lots of people are familiar with around psychological safety, when you're thinking about being in a situation where you can learn and develop, it's not just about being supported, it's also about being challenged. So if you're in a sort of environment which is low support, low challenge, you kind of completely lose your sort of sense of direction and motivation. So you sort of go into apathy. If you're in a space where you have high challenge and no support, you go into that sort of anxiety zones because you're constantly challenge, but there's nobody there sort of supporting you and sort of checking in to make sure you're okay, and you don't have enough resources to get the work done. And the really interesting one is that if you're in high support but you don't have challenge, you sit in comfort zone. So you just kind of plod along. And that can actually sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable. And I think that goes back to what you're describing is like, you know, what am I here for? And you sort of lose that sense of contribution. And comfort zone can affect your well-being sort of negatively as well, because you can start to sort of lose that connection to bigger purpose. So the place where we really thrive is when we are in that high challenge, but we're in an area of challenge where we're getting support, so we have the resources that we need, we have people around us that encourage us, but we're also not so over challenged that we can't do it. There's a really nice place where we're sort of we're able to achieve what we set out to achieve, but we're sort of in a stretch. So there's a sort of a really nice sweet spot of stretch that when we sit in, we really feel like we're flying.
So how do leaders and our listeners think about that, both for themselves and if they are a leader for those that they're serving?
And it's interesting you use the word serving as well in leadership, because I think we don't often think about leadership as serving. And that there's lots of different frameworks of leadership, but I think that servant leadership is one that I quite like, or compassionate leadership. So yeah, I think it is about connecting people to that bigger picture, making them sort of creating environments where people feel like they do have agency, they can make choices. And if they can't make choices, they understand that the constraints that are upon them. So that kind of transparency of, we can't do this at the moment because, so people know why the constraints are there. So giving people choice and agency, helping them see their contribution. So sometimes in organisations, we can get into that kind of real busy work. And I know I've worked in massive corporate organisations where you almost feel like you're box ticking because a task needs to be done and you've lost complete sight of why that task needs to be done and how that actually contributes to the bigger picture. So drawing those lines for people, helping them understand that this might feel like a small task, but this is why we need it to be done. So there's quite a lot of sort of storytelling around there. And then connecting people to their competence, to what they're good at. So really thinking about the skills that you've got in your team and helping people really showcase those, lean into them, learn things. Yeah, those are all things that I think leaders can do. But I think that connection to bigger vision is so important, because you can kind of rally around it then, and you can go through difficult things as an organisation or as a team.
You said something in there that really resonated around why, which I think connects back to awareness as well. So why within an organisation, but why within yourself as well? Why are
Mm.
you doing what you're doing? And that
Mm.
then connects things back to that bigger purpose, doesn't
It
it?
does.
And we've talked about this across the podcast actually, of this sense that it's okay to feel uncomfortable when it's not about you, when
Mm.
it's about something that's bigger. And I definitely feel that whether it's homelessness or mental health, the agenda is not my agenda. The
Mm.
agenda is a societal issue that if I can add some value through my skills, then I will do that. But yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it, when
It's
you
really interesting.
externalize that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, and we heard this from so many of your guests, that kind of, I mean, I like to call it a North Star. That's, yeah, that sense of direction. And it's not necessarily, this is another tension, isn't it? Moving towards something, but knowing that you might not get there and being willing to do it anyway. So that kind of, that sense of direction is, this is what I'm moving towards. I think, you know, with some of the work that you're doing around things like homelessness, if you had the goal of, right, we're going to completely sort out homelessness and we're going to, you know, it's not going to be an issue anymore, you wouldn't even know where to begin, would you? Whereas just making things incrementally better, moving towards something, but not necessarily knowing how you're going to get there, just helps you make these little steps, and helps you stay true to the things that are important to you.
Yeah, I do think sometimes people get debilitated by the big, unwieldy, lofty ambition.
Agree.
And
Yeah.
I agree. I always think of a dial and turning the dial just a few degrees and keeping going. That's
Yeah.
progress, isn't it? Though, from your point of view, given the complexities that we're living in and these big social issues that are not solved by just one thing, what type of leadership do we really need in that sort of space?
Probably not the leaders that we see in the news right now.
I was going to swear then, but I won't.
Yeah, it's well, I want to say it's fascinating, but can it be fascinating when the world is in such a mess? But I think the leaders that are kind of rising to the top on the world politics stage are not the leaders that we need to get us to the next phase. And we've talked about quite a lot of the themes, haven't we, around like being too certain, or, you know, not engaging with the experts or the people that we're trying to serve. So I think leadership going forward has to be more humble, and it has to be more inclusive, and it has to be more flexible as well. I think we see quite a lot of this kind of command and control leadership at the moment, this kind of, you know, what I say goes, no checks and balances in place. So being willing to be flexible with the challenges that we see, because, you know, we have never been in such a complex time where we've got all these different things going on and they all interconnect with each other, and it's really hard to make sense of. So I think the leaders of tomorrow, it's going to be really important for them to acknowledge that they don't have all the answers, but they're willing to kind of go forward and engage with uncertainty and complexity anyway. And I think to do that, they need to have a certain level of flexibility around them. You know, what was working yesterday might not be working today. And that needs a certain level of humility, rather than just like this sort of focus on, that's the path we've chosen, that's what we're doing, even when it's clear that it's not working.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I've definitely seen that over the years in certain environments, let's say, around an inability to accept that what's been chosen is not necessarily the right path. The direction might be right, as in like sat nav is saying north.
Yeah.
But we might need to take a slight detour.
Yeah.
I think it does take brave leaders to step into a space and adapt and learn and hold their hands up and say, well, that might not be working. Let's pivot over here. Pivot might be the wrong word, but yeah. Where have you seen any real good examples of where there's good leadership and adapting?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with some brilliant organisations where they're kind of, I've just finished up a big project with a big international charity, and it was amazing to see how they approached their work. So it was about looking at the impact of leadership learning. So, you know, when we train our leaders here, what is the impact sort of over here? So for our mission, and they went into it so willing to learn. So they didn't go in thinking we need to prove that our leadership learning is having an impact. They went in thinking, well, let's just try and understand it. And when you understand it, when you try and learn, it actually gives you so much more than if you'd gone in just trying to prove, because you're having interesting conversations. You're identifying things that you wouldn't have identified if you've had a tick list of questions. So, yeah, that kind of curiosity and that willing to learn from what's really happening in your organization, I think is, yeah, a really interesting and really useful approach, actually.
So you've spoken really about how language is really important and how we describe things. So whether that's saying we're trying to prove it or we're trying to understand it, it seems quite a big shift, but a small shift, but creates a big shift in terms of how people are then feeling when they're in a space that it's not trying to prove that they're right or wrong, but it's just trying to understand if it's had any impact as well.
Yeah. It definitely fascinating, and it does require a certain level of vulnerability, I think, that sort of, because if you, and you see it all the time in like surveys that people send out about sort of employee engagement, sometimes they'll only ask the questions that they want the answers to, or they'll scale responses when really you need to have an in-depth conversation. So it's being willing to see what's really going on rather than attaching your own narrative onto it about what you think is going on, because the two are often very different. So yeah, it does require a certain level of vulnerability, willingness to sit in uncertainty and complexity, and also a kind of, I think it requires a bit of an inner strength to go, do you know what, whatever happens, I've got the capability and the resources to deal with it.
Yeah. And the other thing that's really come out for me in the conversations is to be vulnerable and to sit in some of these spaces, it comes with privilege. You asked me around my journey, and that's with time, isn't it? So there's a privilege of time and being in spaces and getting around tables and different people that you can be seen, you can be heard. Yeah, anything else that you want to add really around that sense of how power and privilege starts to impact on both how we show up and the tables that we end up around as well?
Yeah. Well, I think if we end up in those situations where we don't feel like we belong and we don't have that kind of same starting position, so we don't have as much privilege or power as other people in the room, I mean, for a start, we don't get to hear different stories and perspectives because people aren't as willing to share. They don't feel safe to share because they don't always feel like when they speak up, their voice is going to be respected and heard. And I think if you're in that room and you have privilege, you assume that when you speak, people will listen. So if you're finding yourself in those situations where you don't have as much power and privilege as others, it's actually the emotional toll that you have to navigate that. It can be so taxing, and it can mean that, you know, your workforce is holding themselves back because they're not sort of leaning into their actual capabilities. They're spending a lot of time trying to fit in, trying to think about, you know, if I speak up, are there going to be personal costs? Am I going to be blamed? Am I going to be so is it going to be held against me when I try to speak up? So having those environments where people feel that they can talk about what's going on for them without fear of consequence, I think is really important.
Yeah, fear of consequences is interesting. We spoken before about when you're a young mum and you're in a career that's not necessarily the career you want to stay in, but you're there and you don't want to challenge it because you need to earn the money.
Yeah.
You know, so you're in a different space when you know, when you've got more privilege, that you can challenge things without fear that that's going to affect your livelihood, for example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's something that's so important for leaders, well, for anybody to think about really, as well as thinking about what that situation is for that individual. You hear a lot of stuff on sort of various podcasts and things about getting up early and winning the day and doing exercise before 5 a.m. or whatever it is. But a lot of those kind of strategies don't acknowledge the reality that a lot of people have, particularly, women that are caregiving. They can't go out and take every opportunity. They can't necessarily travel in the same way that someone who's unencumbered with these sort of additional responsibilities might be. So yeah, sort of being really aware of what the constraints are upon people and sort of doing what we can to understand them and make sure that they're still able to have opportunity and to have a voice.
Yeah, because if we're going to be vulnerable in those spaces, it was talked about on the podcast actually that we trust in people, they're going to hold that and not use that against us, aren't we?
Yeah,
That
definitely.
takes a lot of bravery again, doesn't
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it takes a lot of bravery, and also, finding ourselves in situations where we either feel like we can handle it if somebody uses something against us, or just be in a place where we trust the people around us.
We've spoken about, again, language. It goes back to resilience. I don't always like the word resilience because that can mean different things. Again, this came up on the podcast, means different things to men than it does to women.
Yeah.
But how would you talk about resilience and what does that mean in the workplace?
Well, I think about resilience more like sometimes it can be construed as like sort of this sort of toughness of, battling through. But I think of it more in terms of sort of flexibility. So when we're in a situation that's really difficult, having different ways to sort of navigate through it, and also being able to kind of have resources where we can reset after a period of challenge. And I think, particularly in when you think about the pandemic and, particularly people sort of on the front lines were just having to give and give and give and give. And there wasn't an opportunity to sort of sit back and reset. And I think resilience and building resilience into systems, so not just putting it all on the individual, it's about putting in those points where we can reset and we can support each other and we give people downtime. And that's just as important as having those sort of individual skills where we're able to, relate to ourselves and our emotions in different ways. So yeah, when we talk about resilience, I'm always very reticent to talk about it as purely individual because again, we always keep coming back to context, but it's very contextual as well.
Yeah, definitely. Which brings me on to really about organisational environment. In your experience, what creates a good culture that enables people to be vulnerable, show up as they want to show up, and be able to achieve the things that they should be achieving?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I think so many organisations fall into the trap of trying to label their culture without really thinking what their culture is. So your culture is what your culture is, whatever you call it. And we can make or break culture in an instant. So, we can say our culture is open and inclusive and all the rest of it. But if you've got somebody who isn't experiencing that, then you haven't got an open and inclusive culture. So I think for organisations that are wanting to sort of move towards a particular type of culture, I think the very first thing to do is really understand what their current reality is. And they would need to do that in a way where they were actually going to get real stories. So using external people can sometimes be helpful, being willing to dedicate time to conversations, doing sort of listening exercises, those kinds of things to sort of really gather a picture of what's going on. Again, it goes back to that self-awareness piece, doesn't it? But it's on a bigger level of like, we need to understand where we are and sort of accept where we are before we're able to change.
Yeah.
So I think that's the very first piece. And then from there, tackling the things that are actually an issue rather than what we think they might be.
Mm.
And then really it's about the hard work of thinking about, what do we endorse and what don't we endorse, and being willing to sort of follow up when someone isn't displaying behaviours that align with our culture. And I think that's often where people have real difficulty, because they find those conversations difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think culture's a hard thing to challenge, isn't it? Particularly when it's feeling uncomfortable and you feel like you haven't got the power and privilege to put your hand up or do things that start to transform that. That's
Yeah.
where I often think people either conform or they leave. They vote with their feet, or they
do.
just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And yeah, we do hear a lot about culture, but I think not that many organisations really get it right. And I think it's hard day-to-day work rather than sort of fancy words on a wall.
Yeah, totally agree.
So you talked about that kind of shift from earlier on in your career where you were feeling like you were fitting in, to sort of more through your career and now where you're in those spaces where you belong. What do you think the shift has been for you personally to create that change?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit more intentional about if I'm in a space that I feel like I don't belong, there's a rationale for why I'm in that space, because that's going to create some change. But being able to do that comes with time and privilege to
Yeah.
feel more confident in spaces that you don't naturally belong in those spaces. So, 20 years later, after having an interesting career and not feeling like I belonged in lots of spaces, actually, it just becomes familiar. But for people starting out, that's difficult, isn't it? Without the privilege of time, without the privilege of security at home. My children are now more grown up. I don't have to play it safe, let's say. I can take risks. I can do things that are a bit more, I wouldn't say maverick, but I would say they're definitely more risk taking, because I believe in that thing that's bigger than me,
Yeah.
that I want to have impact in the world, whatever that looks like. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one about that sense of power and privilege that I think Natsai and Sarah taught really well around this sense that you have to earn being able to feel comfortable in that, but also that actually you can do that at whatever level you're at, even if you don't feel like you've got perceived power. If you feel like, it goes back to your agency point, that if this thing is beyond you and you feel like you've got agency to have impact, you're more likely to lean into that. I think that's where I've got over the years, that actually I know one person can make that difference, because you can lean into that and ripple effects happen.
So I wonder then what we can do as women who are a little more established in our careers and are kind of been through this journey, what we might be able to do for people coming through. I mean, I know that I've been impacted by some amazing role models, people who have emulated behaviours I've thought, I'm definitely not doing that.
Yes.
But also people who have just been incredible and been kind and supported me, believed in me when I might not have believed in myself. I'm wondering what we can do when we're sort of in those positions where we might be able to create opportunity for others.
Yeah, interesting. I think listening to this podcast, I would say, because there are amazing women out there, aren't there?
There
You
are,
just
really
have
are.
to look for that and listen and lean into that and find different rooms and different spaces that might not feel naturally comfortable for you to walk in, but you know that where you're at is not right either. So it's, yeah, experimenting, seek them out. All the women we've talked to do mentoring and support other women and are happy to lean into that. I've asked loads of women and men, actually. So I've chatted to great men who have mentored me and had amazing conversations. So great people are happy to help other people and give them a leg up. we've all got to where we've got to with a bit of a leg up somewhere.
Yeah.
So giving chances to those people. And where you see potential, I think nobody likes a finished article, because that's where I think the ego bit comes in.
Yeah.
Where if someone turns up and they're like nice and shiny and it's all brilliant, I'm attracted to the one that's like a bit of a rough diamond, if you like, where you just think, actually, just with a little bit of support, they're going to fly. Then, yeah, how do you seek those people out as well?
Yeah, I love that. And I think, to your point about great people like to be asked. I mean, it's such a privilege when someone comes to you and says, I want to learn from you. And, personally, I will always try and help people if they come to me and say, I'm a bit stuck, or can I have your advice on this thing, or what did you do in this situation? Because actually it's a privilege to be asked for expertise and guidance, and being able to open doors for people who are really passionate and believe in something but might not quite have all the tools yet.
Yeah, definitely. Because you only learn by listening and being in those spaces. So if you're not afforded that, you're not going to learn and evolve, are you? So I love that analogy of opening those doors and allowing people to come in. So I've definitely learned from you. So yeah.
And I've learnt from you.
Yeah. So this has been a fascinating conversation. And any final reflections that you've learnt from the series?
Oh, so many. I think maybe sort of my biggest reflection would be really around how sort of heartening it is to hear about the people that are doing things differently. It's really inspiring to hear about other people's journeys. And I think as well, like, for anyone listening, I would also really encourage people to think about, if they are doubting themselves, if there's something that they're really passionate about, but they're not sure about whether to sort of follow that path, is, the world needs people like you who doubt yourself, because we've got so many overconfident people that are running the show, and we want to hear from those kind of sensitive, thoughtful people who've got so much to contribute. So if sort of self-doubt or lack of confidence is standing in your way and you're struggling to do it for yourself, do it for other people, because we need you. How about you? What's been your sort of key reflections from speaking to all these amazing people?
Yeah, I think for me, this has been like therapy, like on so many levels. I think when you are stuck in your own head and you listen to your own voices, that's often in a negative sense. But I think what I've heard and had conversations around is how they can be really positive things. So hopefully our listeners will understand that actually when you're feeling uncomfortable, that doesn't mean to say that you should stop doing what you are doing if that purpose has got greater benefits for society, and that you don't have to have a certain leadership style that is in the traditional sense, that actually there's amazing people with a humility and human first approach that can create change in a much better way than what we've got in society now. So it fills me full of hope, actually, that actually, we can get some momentum, and there is a different way.
Yeah, there is. Brilliant.
Thanks for listening to Against the Tide, brought to you by Joe Metcalf and Louise Kavanagh. We're grateful to the team at Sticks and Glass in Leeds and Bison Studios in London, our inspiring guests and wonderful listeners. Subscribe to Against the Tide wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode.